Dear 11-Bit Studios, I'm a huge fan of Frostpunk. That's probably evident by the fact I'm making videos on the game years after it first released. One of my favorite aspects of the game is the overlap between the game's lore and real-world science and events. But there is one gnawing issue. The entire premise of the game makes no goddamn sense. If the world was getting colder, why would they ever decide to go into the cold, barren north rather than the south, where it should be warmer? What narrative logic leaps are needed to justify this game's cool aesthetic? But then I got to thinking, why would anyone try to build humanity's last refuge from an apocalyptic ice age in the subarctic north? Could there possibly be a logical reason for it to be there? Well, that's the idea that we're going to be exploring in this episode of Ronin Speaks, your tangential learning experience. In the 2004 movie, The Day After Tomorrow, the world faces a similar return to the Ice Age, with cataclysmic storms that plunge the Northern Hemisphere into a deep freeze, similar to what we see in Frostpunk. However, the Ice Age is caused by a completely different phenomenon, the slowing of the North Atlantic Current due to the influx of fresh water from the melting ice caps, rather than a volcanic winter. Interestingly enough, this slowing is something that is actually happening at this very moment. As with all great fiction, writers should take a kernel of truth and stretch it to the nth degree, rather than simply pulling some quantum technobabble bullshit out of their ass. In the movie, they try to evacuate everyone as far south as possible. The obvious decision. If it's getting colder in the north, why not just move south? So why on earth would anyone decide to build the last refuge of humanity, very specifically in the north? Well, in various loading screen lore entries and during the last autumn, we learned that many people are in fact fleeing from Europe to their warmer colonies. This has led to overcrowding, disease, famine, and discontent in those colonies. One important factor that the happy ending of The Day After Tomorrow completely overshadows is the fact that the vast majority of the world's productive farmland is now located underneath massive glaciers. It won't matter how many people you evacuate into a safer climate if there isn't any way to actually support them. Everyone might be celebrating survival and cooperation now. How about later on? Fish and guests stink after 3 days. How will scarce resources be distributed after taking in so many refugees? Will groups come to distrust one another, or will they actually be able to work together to survive? Or will general mismanagement, disorder, and desperation lead to people figuratively and even literally tearing and eating each other in order to ensure their own survival? These are the kinds of dilemmas that Frostpunk faces the player with. Imagine the great scenarios and stories that can be made for different colonies outside of the Frostlands and its generator cities, like people surviving out of a steel mill or coal mine in Europe, or a penal colony in Australia. There are three closely related reasons why the generator cities were located in the subarctic north. First and foremost, it's because they would be isolated there. Second, the subarctic biomes would be the least affected by global cooling compared to an area with a warmer climate. Third is very closely related to the first two, and that is sustainability. We already touched on the refugee issue. If there is any hope for a refuge from the winter, anywhere, then people will fight for the possibility of getting there. This is something we see in the refugee scenario or the builder start in endless mode. During the last autumn, we also learned that the construction of the generators themselves were a rather closely guarded secret, as the workers themselves had no idea where they were even going. And as captain, you are tasked with censoring the correspondence of the workers themselves in order to maintain that secret. This is all likely to ensure that those selected for evacuation will go as close to plan as possible without the interference of other outside forces. On-site production of resources is essential for the survival of the city, as you will need it to construct buildings and provide essential heat and power for its machinery. Another important factor regarding these resources is the fact that they would have been completely untapped until this point. Not only would there be ample non-renewable resources like coal and iron, but also relatively stable ecosystem services like fish and wildlife to hunt, or plants and lichens to forage. All of the previous reasons revolve around one central tenet: one of sustainability. The isolation helps to ensure that the population of each city will be as planned to prevent overpopulation due to an excess of refugees. Ironically, the cold climate of subarctic regions might actually be their saving grace in the Frostpunk world, as the plants and animals would be the most resilient to the extreme global cooling that they'd face. Take our real-world climate change as an example. Many scientists consider that the rapid loss of biodiversity seen throughout the world constitutes Earth's sixth mass extinction event. While habitat loss and degradation due to human activities are a significant direct factor, climate change is the elephant in the room as a driving indirect factor. Remember that the IPCC considers catastrophic climate change as 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages. We aren't even at that point yet, and this warming trend has been going on for the better part of a century. Now consider that the climate of the Pleistocene Ice Age was over 5 degrees Celsius colder than the present day. The world of Frostpunk likely faced a similar or even greater degree of cooling in the span of a few years, and the world in The Day After Tomorrow faced that in the span of a few weeks. Simply put, the environment as we know it could not sustain itself in the face of such a cataclysmic climate shock. The sheer changes and extinctions that would have to occur to maintain itself would be, in a word, unpredictable. However, the one place that would be the most stable and slightly more predictable would be an area that is already cold, faces severe frost, and wildlife is already accustomed to temperatures well below freezing. And that one place that best fills that role is the subarctic regions of northern Canada, where there are ample natural resource deposits of coal, iron, and oil, as well as thousands of miles of forest and wilderness between the generator sites and the closest light of civilization. In addition, you'd have access to the sea for ships to transport workers and materials for their construction. So as it turns out, the setting of Frostpunk makes a bit more sense than you might think at a glance. Good on you, 11-bit. And here's to Frostpunk 2 being just as well crafted as this one. I can't wait to take a deep dive into that one. And until we meet again, this is the Ronin.